All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this month's Digging In with TPS MTSU. We really appreciate it. And we've got a few new faces today, which is really exciting. For those of you who are new and maybe not quite as familiar with our team, we've got our staff joining us today, Dr. Stacy Graham and our graduate research assistants, Layla Smallwood and October Kamira. So we'll be in the chat box and stuff, so feel free to ask us questions, let us know if you have any issues, and we'll be responding to those in the chat. So this month, before we kind of get into our topic, a few housekeeping things. First, do remember to keep your mics muted throughout the presentation. This will help us to keep cleaner recording, because we are, of course, recording this to share on our YouTube channel. Also, if you want to go ahead and find your name or find yourself in the participant list, to make sure it's showing your first and last name, and that just helps us as we're responding to folks in the chat box, and also keeping a list of folks who attended for reporting purposes. And then we do want the day's session to be interactive. So again, make use of that chat box. Go ahead, open it up, introduce yourselves. Telling us where you're joining from would be a great way to start. We have reaction buttons, so you can feel free to use those. And we do have a polling question that we'll be doing as well. Again, because of today's session, we will just be responding to things within the chat. So again, do keep your mics muted. You can follow along. All of the resources for today's session can be found on our Padlet. And here is a link for that. And I will share that again at the end, and we'll drop that into the chat box. But that is where you can find links to the newsletter, as well as links to some of the PowerPoints and such, as well as all of the information for the previous sessions in our Digging In series. So with that, let me turn things over to my colleague, Stacy Graham, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the theme this month.
Thank you, Kira. I am going to share my screen so that we can look at the newsletter together for a minute. Many of you already get this, and maybe you've already looked at this. We sent this out almost 2 weeks ago. Maybe it's been a week and a half. So we have touched on Native American topics several times in the course of our TPS materials and workshops. It's kind of challenging considering how you have to navigate the Library of Congress resources that are available. There certainly aren't as many as we would like for some topics, but we really wanted to give this another shot. And we did find some really great stuff that might be hard. It's the kind of stuff that you would have to take a lot of time to dig into. So we thought, this is great. We will do that. Then we will present you with the excerpts that are most useful, and then put them in a newsletter so that you can have the most packaged materials to cover this topic, which is Native American removal and resistance. And I realize that different people have different opinions about the usage of words and names. And so if anyone feels like we need to be using any kind of terms and differently, please advise us. We tend to use Native American, American Indian, Indigenous Americans kind of interchangeably in this newsletter. But we are certainly open to suggestions as to how we should handle that, or how you handle that in the classroom. So like I said, we're just going to be doing that during the webinar too. With not because of any specific reason, but because in our sources and in a lot of the secondary sources that we read, that seems to be interchangeable. But with removal and resistance, this tends to obviously cast the role of Native Americans as a very passive one, because so many things are done to them, but then they resist this kind of intervention by the US military and US government. And of course, most of these resistance stories, your students think they all end up sadly, and they kind of do. I remember reading Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and it's just chapter after chapter after chapter of, oh my God. But there are so many things in current news that you can tie this to. And I mentioned just in the blurb, the Keystone Pipeline demonstrations over the past, couple of years. That is in the same tradition of resistance about the federal government going back on promises as to how Native American lands can be used and how much of a say the Native Americans actually have in that. And so these issues are still around, and sometimes there are triumphs as well. So I ran across a term that was new to me. It may not be new to you when I was doing some research, and that is survivance. And so I've linked to it in the blurb. It links to a book that an Anishinaabe literary critic, Gerald Wiesenor, published a book in like 2008. It's an anthology of essays about survivance of different Native American groups in the United States. And basically this is this is really trying to emphasize the agency that Native Americans had, and so that we're not just portraying them as victims, but how do they actively continue to hold on to their cultural traditions in the midst of so many forces that would seemingly put an end to those. And so that long history is something to be celebrated. And so that's why I've included that in here. And of course, for our awesome source of the month, we salute our brand new Department of the Interior Secretary, the very first Native American person to hold that role, which is just wonderful irony, considering that the Department of the Interior oversaw Indian reservations, but Deb Haaland. So yeah, she definitely had to make our front page. So in this issue, we also, and I'm going to be delving into the Potawatomi in just a minute. We also have a lesson idea on the Second Seminole War, using all these great examples of artwork from the time period from the Library of Congress. We have one on the Muscogee Nation that Kira's going to be delving into a little bit later. And then we have a lesson idea on Wounded Knee. And so our lesson ideas cover two main periods of time: your early 19th century and your later 19th century. Your early 19th century, of course, with the initial westward expansion, and then, of course, a lot of removal taking place after the passing of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And that's going to fall, of course, within 8th grade survey. But then Wounded Knee, when westward expansion goes west across the continent, and after the Civil War, you have a lot of Indian fighting out west, and Wounded Knee being a very well-known instance of that in the later 19th century. So this is getting into the high school history standards. So, but we also try to touch on 4th grade a little bit, and then we also touch on the visual arts standards for the Seminole War. So we're trying to not just be 8th grade and high school. And then for page 4, we have a really great map of Indian reservations in 1892. And then Layla put a link for a similar map from 2016. So you can do a really interesting comparison with your students about how that has changed. The American Indian Movement, there's a really great I Didn't Learn That guide that October created that we'll mention again later in the resources section. The U.S. Poet Laureate currently is a Native American author named Joy Harjo. This would have been something that would have been easy for me to check, and I did it, and I apologize. I do not know how to pronounce her last name. I just see it all over the place because, she's featured in a lot of Library of Congress materials. But yes, she's a member of the Creek Nation. And the Crazy Horse Monument, which is kind of on my bucket list. And, I love Carol Highsmith photos, and it's like, it's the first time I've ever seen Carol Highsmith in one of her own photos. And here she is grinning in front of Crazy Horse. I'm like, why out of all the places that she photographs does she want to be in her picture of Crazy Horse? And I thought maybe it held some special significance for her. I don't know. But okay, so before we get further in to delving, I'm going to launch a poll, or I'm going to ask if Kira will launch the poll. There we go. So for those of you watching, you can't see the poll on the screen, but the question is, which of the following Native American groups was forcibly removed by the US government? And you can list as many of these as you want. So your choices are the Miami, the Choctaw, the Shawnee, the Arapaho, the Apache, the Kiowa, the Kickapoo, and the Cheyenne. So we have, so everyone seems to be giving a vote to every single one of these choices. Okay. We're watching the results coming in. We have 44% who have voted so far. And most people are voting for all of them. There are, there's a little bit of a discrepancy there. Okay. Now the Shawnee has the most votes. Okay. Right, still getting some results in. Okay, Shawnee tied with Choctaw.
All right, so if you want to get your votes, then we're going to close the voting in just a second.
Yeah, if anyone wants to add. We have 72% returns. All right, so we're sharing the polling results, and 12 out of 13 people voted for the Choctaw, and that was the most. Shawnee and Arapaho got 11 votes each, and then every other group got 10 votes. So most people would think that every single one of these groups was forcibly removed, and you would be correct. Now, so thank you very much for that. I'm gonna close out the poll. Now, obviously, when we're talking about forcible removal, it's not going to be the exact same experience for everybody within the group that identifies as a certain Native American tribe, because there were lots of divisions, there were lots of things that happened over time. Sometimes there were splits within these nations, and some people moved in a more cooperative manner, and some people stayed and resisted. Some people were more forcibly removed than others. Some people resisted to a greater degree than others within the same Indian tribe. So I do want to make sure that I note that there's obviously a lot of gray area in there. But for all of those examples that I listed, there were at least part of those tribes that were forcibly removed at some point in time by the US government, usually via the US military, right? And usually because of treaties that were made obsolete by the US government on purpose because of white settlement. So, and that is something that we all kind of know the general gist, but I don't know all the specific instances that happen, and it's a little bit different for everybody. But I have this map that I started reading this book for fun just like 2 days ago, and it actually started talking about Indian removal, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to be talking about that on Thursday. So I'm going to show you this map. It's just from page 43. I took a picture. The book is called How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr. And so here's this just very simplistic map of how over the course of the 19th century, and even a little bit earlier for groups like Seneca and Delaware, you had all these different tribes moving to one of the very first territories. And of course, his book is all about territories in the United States. And I have this quote that I'm going to read from this chapter because I thought it was kind of an interesting way to think about it. So he says, it was as if someone had depopulated most of Europe and shunted remnants from each country to an allotment in Romania, which sounds really ridiculous when we think about it in terms of, white European nations, but that's basically what happened in the United States. And so I think, thinking about it in terms of the Indians in the 19th century, your students might think about it more as people that don't really have a lot to do with them, or maybe they do in certain parts of Tennessee, feel a more of a connection than others. But telling them an analogy that actually might include some more of their ancestors might kind of bring it home a bit more. Okay, so I'm gonna actually launch into our first example, which is the Potawatomi Trail of Death. Now, of course, in Tennessee, we learn about the Trail of Tears with the Cherokee removal. But this happened all over the eastern part, the Midwest, the upper South, the lower South. This happened to lots of different groups. And so I think that this was new to me. This is probably what Indiana school children learn the way that Tennessee kids learn about the Trail of Tears, but so this is their version of that. But the Potawatomi were a group that lived in kind of like southern Michigan, northern Indiana. And this was like at the exact same time in 1838. And so I got really fascinated by this example of it. And so I just want to show you a little bit about, if you look at this one, I apologize, there's no pretty image to go along with this lesson idea because the primary sources are all text-based. But I want to go through some of these links so that you have a sense of the materials available for you if you want to teach this in your classroom. So I first learned about this from actually one of our important links. How did 6 different Native nations try to avoid removal? Oh my gosh, every time somebody writes something in the chat box, the black thing comes down and I can't click on my tabs. Oh, that's gonna be a problem. Okay, so this is from the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, which has great resources. And so it has these 6 different case studies. And I was like, oh, Potawatomi Nation, I don't know about that. And so it has this little, kind of intro graphic talking about Chief Menominee and, the way that he resisted removal. And then you can go to the case study and it has all these different parts of it. And so that's linked from the very bottom here as well. But that's how I started reading about this. And then I did a little bit more digging, and this first link is actually from the Indiana History blog that's written out of the Indiana Historical Bureau of the Indiana State Library. So I thought, well, that sounds like a pretty legit source. And this is a very lengthy blog article, so I wouldn't recommend assigning it to students, but it's interesting for you in terms of taking this complicated story and putting it in a pretty easy to follow narrative. And this is where I learned about the survivants, and they link to that book that I mentioned earlier. And so this is also good for finding some images. These are not at the Library of Congress images, but they were made by this man named George Winter, who was present and was part of this. And he was this white man, and he made these illustrations of the Potawatomi at this time. And so they're just really valuable primary sources. It's not often that you actually have, drawings of like the Potawatomi emigration. Now, emigration is a very soft word to use for this kind of removal. But this is a great source, even just for the images, even if you don't use the, okay. All right, you guys can't see it when the black bar comes down on my screen, but oh, that's annoying. Okay, so that's what that is a link to. So basically, we're talking about, the Potawatomi had been, there are several different instances of resistance. They sided with the French during the French and Indian War. They sided with Tecumseh during the War of 1812. So, they have a pretty good pedigree of resisting US encroachment. And of course, there's a lot of really complicated stuff about treaties. It's never just one treaty. There's constant treaties. There's like 10 treaties or something. And so I wouldn't really confuse your students with the details, but I do link to a page that talks about the treaties. I'm gonna just zoom in a little bit. It's just so you can see that from this, from December 1834 to February 1837, this is how many treaties this one group of people supposedly signed. But then you can see they actually list the chief and the commissioner. So it's not all the same people. And, of course, Chief Menominee is not on here anywhere because he refused to sign. But this is just to give you a reference and to give students the idea that there are a lot of treaties and it's complicated, but basically all they really need to know is that, so one of these treaties in 1832, which was called the Treaty of Tippecanoe, it kind of ensured that the Potawatomi were going to get to keep certain lands where they were. But then in 1836, they kind of reclaimed those lands. They got those lands ceded back to them from the Potawatomi with a 2-year time limit, saying, okay, you're signing away these lands. We're going to give you annuities, meaning money. We're going to pay you money, and you have to move in 2 years. And so it's when they come in 1838 and the white settlers are like, they're still here. And the federal government goes, you said you would leave. And Chief Menominee goes, I never said that I would leave. And then the soldiers come in and the Trail of Death is what happens. But this whole issue of what annuities are was also something that your students may not be very familiar with. And so what's linked there is, again, this is not something that you would want to share with your students, but it is another primary source that's talking about this incident that happened when the Indians came to collect some annuities. And there was a lot of unfairness taking place. And you get a sense here of just how the government is kind of taking advantage of the situation and putting them in a position where they're either dependent or they're, it's not fair all around. And that's a different source, but I just linked it there just in case you want to do further research. Okay, so the Indian Removal Act link here, it links to a page at the Library of Congress where they have a research guide, because this is one of their primary documents in American history. And this is something that we've linked to previously when dealing with the Trail of Tears and dealing with Andrew Jackson. So this is a really great resource to get more information from. So that's here. And so they're moving to a reservation in Kansas. It's not just Oklahoma. There was a large Indian territory that was there before it was whittled down to what is now Oklahoma. And so they were supposed to go to Kansas. And then Chief Menominee, he refused to sign. He tried to resist, and then they were forced out. And so I have used, okay, no, I haven't used this one. This is a different one. So he's very well known in these parts in Indiana and also in Kansas. So there's this statue to him, and it was actually put in place by this man named Daniel McDonald, who wrote a book about the removal of the Potawatomi Indians in 1899, and I'll mention him again in another minute. And so he was an Indiana legislator, and he raised the money to build this. And it says the statue is believed to be the only statue of an Indian chief ever paid for by a state legislature. And I think Tennessee needs to pony up and become the second state to build a statue to an Indian chief, just so that Indiana can't be the only one. But this is cool because it connects students to places in the landscape, because you can actually follow this trail of death. Like they actually have, you know, signage and some information on websites about that. So that's something that if you wanted to do some mapping with them, you could, like what is left to see there nowadays, you could do that. And then the Trail of Death link is to the Kansapedia, which I have used before when talking about Benjamin Pap Singleton. So I was very happy to be back in the Kansapedia by the Kansas Historical Society. And this is a pretty easy to read summary of this. So I would say this is totally appropriate if you want to give your 8th graders some contextual bit for them to read. And it all of the different places have a quote from Chief Menominee to Abel Pepper. This is his resistance moment. The president does not know the truth. He, like me, has been imposed upon. He does not know that you made my young chiefs drunk and got their consent and pretended to get mine. He would not drive me from my home and the graves of my tribe and my children who have gone to the Great Spirit, nor allow you to tell me that your braves will take me tied like a dog. So this was the primary source quote I was hoping for, but I wanted to find it from the Library of Congress. So I'm going to show you where I found it. So they're going back to Daniel MacDonald. That book that he wrote in 1899 is available through the Library of Congress. And it's a big, long book with lots of great stuff. Now, of course, he wrote it in 1899, but he just has these huge excerpts from primary sources from all the people who were involved. And so this is what the primary source looks like. And here, of course, is the table I showed you earlier of the treaties. And there are some images too. This is Abel Pepper. And so some of it is he is writing like a historian, you know, about what happened. And a lot of it is just big chunks of quotes. So what I did was I separated this into 6 different parts. So you can separate your students into 6 different groups and give each one a page. And so each of these has a select excerpt from a different point of view. So the source number 1 is Chief Menominee, and this is the quote, but this is the whole paragraph of the quote. And so it actually goes on, to say that my brother, the president, is just, but he listens to the word of the young chiefs who have lied. And when he knows the truth, he will leave me to my own. I have not sold my lands. I will not sell them. I have not signed any treaty and will not sign any. I am not going to leave my lands, and I don't want to hear anything more about it. And I'm like, that's the best part. How could you leave that out? So each of these different pages has, okay, source number 1, who said it, a little bit of information about who that person is, and 2 or 3 discussion questions so that they can talk about these in their little pairs or groups. And the cool thing about this one is they actually include right above it, like he first includes using the Roman alphabet, the language in which he spoke it, and then it's translated into English. So obviously Menominee didn't speak in English these words. He spoke in his own language and it was translated into this. But it'd be kind of cool if your students wanted to see what that looked like. So, so yes, and then there are a few from General Tipton, who was the Indian agent who ultimately had to order this event, which came to be known as the Trail of Death. So here he is, talking about why it was necessary. Basically, he's implying that if the military hadn't been there, there would have been full-scale bloodshed between the Indians and the settlers. But he's not very sympathetic to the Indians in this one, because he's saying that, punish the insolence of the Indians could have prevented bloodshed. So yeah, he's kind of blaming them for starting hostilities. This is another General Tipton one, where he is kind of recounting his understanding of how this whole thing kind of, what set it off. But the really cool General Tipton source, sorry, there are 3 of these are General Tipton, is he kept a diary every day and wrote little notes down on this march. And this is like a 600-mile march from northern Indiana to Kansas. And so each day and these are typical entries of this diary. So, a distance of 17 miles was accomplished, difficulties of procuring subsistence and forage, which you'll have to translate for your students. 2 children died this day. A child and a man died. A very old woman died. People are sick, constantly falling sick. So it's really heartbreaking, this day by day. But it's a very straightforward account, this is what happened. But it's heartbreaking though in the details. And then there was a Catholic priest who had been the priest of the settlement of Menominee's band. And he went with them on this trip. And he actually got sick and died on his way back, which was kind of sad. But yeah, so here is some words from Father Benjamin Pettit. And then we have 3 separate eyewitness accounts. One of them was a wagoner who went on the trip and said that the Indians were not harmed in any way. But then you have 2 kind of more sympathetic, people who were a bit younger and saying it was so sad that they had to leave, even though my dad was one of the people guarding Menominee, and so I just thought those are kind of interesting and also things that would be appropriate for 8th grade reading levels. So that's kind of how this whole one is structured. And obviously, I only put the social studies standard there, but you could do a lot of English language arts there as well. So I am actually going to segue into another 1830s removal story from our newsletter, which is the Muscogee. So I am going to turn it over to Kira now.
Thank you, Stacy. So let's see, let me bring up my... So for my lesson idea this month, I was looking at possible topics. I started doing a little reading on the Creek because honestly, I knew very little about them. But seen them pop up largely around like War of 1812 and the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and those points is usually when they show up in Tennessee curriculum. And so as I started doing a little reading, got really fascinated by some of the information that I found. And so, the story around this one particular treaty, which actually happens prior to the Indian Removal Act, I thought was really very, very interesting and showed really one of these moments where it feels like, the Creek have actually made some headway and are going to be able to keep their homeland. And of course, we know that later on that doesn't happen, but it's really a very interesting story that runs kind of counter to some of the other narratives that I had seen. So that's kind of what led me on this particular journey. So before I kind of jump into the full story, kind of the Treaty of Indian Springs and some of the 2 sources that I featured in my lesson idea, Let's take just a second to think about what we know about the Muscogee or Creek Nation. So in the chat box, if you would, if you want to kind of drop in some things that you know about the Muscogee or Creek, and then we'll kind of start from there and maybe build out a little bit of context before we jump into the details around this one particular treaty. So again, what are some things that we know about the Muscogee Creek Nation? And Stacy, if I could get you or Layla one to.
Yep. Well, so far we know that it's one of the ones that was in Tennessee.
Okay.
And as I mentioned earlier, it was the poet laureate is from this tribe, Joy
Hardjoy. Yeah.
Thank you. The saying, Lord willing, and if the creek don't rise, refers to them and not a body of water. Are you kidding me, Rosa? Thanks.
I don't think I knew that.
I did not know that. Because of their involvement in the War of 1812.
Oh.
Mind blown. I have been saying that very cavalierly, and now I will think better of it. I know that there's a song by Merle Haggard called Okie from Muscogee.
Okay.
That's me. I'm not reading that off the chat box because that's a silly thing to mention.
So, see. So some things that I just, kind of points that we really want to bring up to students. One is that it's really more of a confederacy than a nation. So it's a confederacy of different cultural groups. And it's a multi-ethnic group. So many of the Creek, although they all descend from the Mississippian period, the same as the Cherokee and the Choctaw, the Creek are also made up of people who were coming from the Spanish missions in Georgia and Florida, as well as refugees from the Yuchi, the Shawnee, the Chickasaw, and the Natchez. And a lot of them also had ties to Scottish immigrants. So a lot of them were kind of multi-ethnic. So you have men who were Scottish immigrants marrying Creek women. And then, of course, then their offspring did have kind of ties to both sides. So there's a few things to note. They play a really important role in the colonial and revolutionary period. And they are actually described as the most powerful nation in the Southeast in the late 1700s. So many of the settlements are along the Chattahoochee, the lower Tallapoosa, and the central Coosa rivers, again, in kind of Alabama, Georgia area. And just prior to removal, they numbered upwards of 21,000 people. Many of them, again, are in towns, kind of how their nation was organized was in townships. And there were between 30 and 60 towns, again, there and largely through Alabama and Georgia. They are made up of really kind of three distinct groups. So you have the lower, what we often see as the lower Creek, and they are the Ochese or the Coweta. And then there are two different groups of upper creeks. So there are the Tallapoosa and the Abeka, and I may be mispronouncing those, so forgive me if I am. And many of them were, largely their economy was about farming and agriculture, with some hunting. As more Europeans came over and they built relationships with first the Spanish and then the British and stuff who were in South Carolina, there was a lot of trading that took place, and that really had a major impact on the economy and their, kind of their relationships going forward. So for our students, though, for this lesson idea, we really want to think about kind of starting just a little bit later. You might want to share a little bit about some of those basics about the creeks, but for our reference here, our reference timeline for the sources we're going to look at, I wanted to note kind of the first date that's kind of important is 1796, and the U.S. government enacts their plan to civilize Indians, and Benjamin Hawkins is named the head of that project. He actually lives with the Creeks for a long period of time. And so during the course of that plan to civilize, one of the things that comes out of that is the formation of the Creek National Council. And so they play an important role later on when we get into the Treaty of Indian Springs. So 1813, 1814, of course, we got the Creek War going on, and that is largely a war, both a war with the US government as well as internal conflicts that were happening within the Creek Nation. You had some, especially Lower Creek, who had close economic ties and relationships to both, people in Georgia, the US government, and were more open to their, to conversations and to relationships with the white settlers. And then you had what are called traditionalists. Many of them were Upper Creeks who wanted less to do with the US government and were less open to the white settlers who were coming in. So that is kind of the conflict that's going on within the Creek War. And of course, that just intensifies after that war. And so we get to February 12th of 1825. And this is kind of the start of our story. And William McIntosh, who is a leader in the Lower Creek, signs the Treaty of Indian Springs. And that treaty cedes all the Lower Creek land in Georgia and a large section in Alabama to the US government. In exchange, they get comparable amounts of land west of the Mississippi, some funds to relocate, and payment for the land. The issue is the treaty was widely opposed within the Creek Nation and had not been approved by the Creek National Council. And why that is important is that prior to all this and prior to signing the treaty, the Creek National Council had actually said that anyone who tries to sell or give up our land without our approval is subject to death. They would not negotiate with the people the U.S. government was sending down trying to get them to cede land until the U.S. government was able to find McIntosh, who was willing to work with them and sign this treaty. So the first document that I feature in the lesson idea to have students look at is this one right here. And I'm going to focus largely just on the second paragraph because I think that's really kind of the meat of what's here. You will note that this is signed 8 days after the Treaty of Indian Springs is signed. So here in this letter, and I'll read this in case you guys have trouble reading the text on your screens. So again, starting with that second paragraph, our father, at the Treaty of Broken Arrow, the chiefs got jealous of McIntosh and threatened to kill him. The charge against him was that he wanted to sell land to the commissioners of the United States. In 1824, a few chiefs met at a place called the Polecat Springs and passed a law that if any person should sell land or offer it for sale, guns and rope should be their end. This law was intended to prevent General McIntosh from selling land, but it was not agreeable to the laws of the nation. If it was intended to be the national law, it ought to have been read before the national chiefs and let them determine it, not collect a few chiefs to make a law. Could an individual state pass a law to extend all over the United States, or one county make and enforce a law for the government of the whole state? The guns and rope are taken from the pattern of the Cherokee. Therefore, we do not consider it a law of the nation to be enforced. It is merely law among themselves. But those who signed their names to the pattern of the Cherokee determined to execute the law. This is the report from some of our friends. If they determine, we are ready to defend ourselves. And with your assistance, they will find a great difference in numbers. Our characteristic disposition is to treat all mankind as friends, brothers, and relations. We determine never to impose on any man, but to treat all as friends. And you can see, again, the people who signed it. And again, these are all people who were aligned with McIntosh. So thinking about what we have here, we'd want to talk with our students about, the purpose of this letter, why it was written. So again, in the chat box, if you want to kind of maybe be noting, some things that you find interesting about this. And I think one thing is very clear is that, again, 8 days after this treaty, McIntosh and his people are already fearful of attack. And so again, they're trying to lay out, essentially they need protection in some ways, and trying to also say how, make the argument for why they are not at fault, that it is the others who are, being the aggressors toward them that are at fault and why they deserve protection. And so again, this is coming from their perspective, again, why they think that they are in the right. So again, if you guys want to note anything that you find interesting in the language there, you can drop that in the chat box. I do think it's really interesting here, again, their reference to the Cherokee. And I think it would be interesting to bring up to your students relationships between, segments of the Creek and segments of the Cherokee, and, how that dynamic played into this time period. Because again, we have the very complicated relationships between white settlers, the U.S. government, and the Creeks and others. And then we think about also the relationships between the different Indian nations. So it makes for very complicated, diplomacy and issues during the time period. All right, so we have that letter. That's February 20th, 1825. So kind of building out from that. So within just a couple months, McIntosh and 3 others are executed for their role in the Treaty of Indian Springs. And this is again where the Creek National Council has determined that they violated their law, and they were executed because of it. Also during this time period, we have a delegation of Creek who are sent to Washington, D.C. to try to negotiate and have the treaty nullified. And the U.S. government, this is during the John Quincy Adams presidency, actually sends a commissioner to come down and investigate what happened. And they are successful in getting this treaty nullified, which honestly is what got me started. This is that they were successful in getting the treaty nullified. I just thought that was amazing that they were able to do that. So what happens with the treaty is that you have 2 people, both of them, one of them Upper Creek, one of them Lower Creek, Apostolo Yaholo and Little Prince. They are the ones who go to DC to help to work out a compromise. And they get the Second Treaty of Washington, which replaces the Treaty of Indian Springs after the US government determines that it was actually signed fraudulently. And this really represents a compromise, that we see again. It's really significant. The new treaty, what happens with it is it actually gives back to the Creek their land in Alabama, but it does cede a lot of the Lower Creek land in Georgia. Now, what I find really interesting about that was that a lot of that Lower Creek land was that was where McIntosh and many of his followers lived. So they went ahead and ceded McIntosh's land, but then kept all of the land in Alabama. And also Georgia was, I think, much more aggressive in their work to push a lot of the Native people out of the state. Alabama wasn't quite as aggressive yet in pushing people out as Georgia had been at that point. And then, of course, they also get some payment for the land that's ceded, and they also get money to help the people who were the Creek, McIntosh's, largely his people, who were being immigrated west of the Mississippi as part of that payment. And it was thought that this was a huge success, and that this would actually relieve a bit of the pressure that the Creek, and again, especially Upper Creek and those who were in Alabama, were feeling, and they thought that this might, save the homeland. Of course, that's not what happens. And so I found this letter, which I thought was just like, this is such a cool letter. So this is a little over a year after the Second Treaty of Washington. And it says, it's addressed from the Creek Nation, gentlemen, which again, also interesting that they started that way as opposed to the previous letter that starts with the Our Father. We, the undersigned, chiefs and headmen of the Creek Nation, having learned with great regret that you are engaged in surveying the land west of the line of the late treaty, and which was not ceded by that treaty, we have again to request and demand of you in the most friendly terms that you will desist from stretching a chain over any of our lands not ceded by the said treaty. We flattered ourselves, and we had a right to believe the stipulations of that treaty would have been friendly observed by all parties concerned, and that our former differences with our neighbors, the Georgians, would have been finally settled, and that we would in future lived in the strictest friendship in all intercourse. We are determined on our part not to do an act that can be calculated to give offense, but we have rights, and we hope they will be respected. We, your friends. And you'll note that the first 2 signatories on this letter are the 2 who were in Washington, D.C. that helped to negotiate the Second Treaty of Washington. So again, this letter, you can dissect it with your students. Again, talk about what is the purpose, what is the tone of this letter? Because the difference in tone between these two letters is really very interesting. The way the different types of language that they use and how they're addressing the officials in the US government that they are talking with. Um, and again, you could also then build out from this more of a timeline activity, putting this then into context with what happens next in the story of creek removal. Because again, this is really just the beginning of that story, especially as the Muscogee Creek Nation begins to lose land in Alabama. You could also then do a comparison and compare what was happening with the creek with what happened with the Cherokee, which I think is also a really interesting activity, and one that I actually am probably going to be working on for inclusion for a workshop we're going to do in June. So some sources that I used in this, again, some secondary sources, because again, a lot of this is, again, stuff that I have not seen, in textbooks that I've looked at. And so if you're looking for some good secondary material to help, build some context for your students, I found some great articles with the Encyclopedia of Alabama. And actually there's one professor or one academic who wrote all of these. And I actually also found his dissertation from the University of Auburn, which is also about the creek. You can find that online. So these are great. These encyclopedia entries are really great. Again, short pieces that you can get into some good information. They're interlinked, and so you find bios on a lot of these key figures. The details around some of these treaties. The creek article is a really good kind of overview piece. So again, this is really good. And they also link out to some other sites and some other references. So again, for secondary source material, I found that to be very, very helpful. So again, hopefully this will give you guys some ideas and maybe, pique your curiosity to learn a little bit more of the story of the creek. I know it did mine. And I said, I'm hoping to create some additional activities and materials around that for us to use this summer. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn things over to Layla to talk about how she found some of the resources that we found this month.
Yeah, hey, can y'all hear me? Yeah, cool. All right, so I see a lot of familiar faces, some new faces. Hi, my name is Layla. So I'm a graduate research assistant with Teaching with Primary Sources MTSU. And today, I'm not going to be sharing with you a lesson idea. I'm just going to be sharing with you a few of the pieces I found for my lesson idea on Wounded Knee and kind of like that thought process that I go through when looking for lesson resources and stuff like that, for lesson idea resources. So the first thing I did, and I think we all do this at TPS, we Control F in the standards, right? To see what we can find and to see how we can fit in what we want to work on with the curriculum standards. And I was shocked to find out that there were no specific standards on Wounded Knee for Tennessee State Social Studies standards, nothing. The one standard that I did find that I kind of used to work with was a high school U.S. history standard, and it is examine federal policies towards American Indians, including the movement to reservations, assimilation, boarding schools, and the Dawes Act. The thing is, there are all these different treaties and conflicts leading up to these events, right? So we have to find out and pull from these other documents. That's kind of how I started. I found that standard, knew I wanted to work with it, and knew I wanted to do something on Wounded Knee and the government policies leading up to Wounded Knee, and really the public response, right, as well. So I started out, and I know I do this, you can go through the Library of Congress homepage, but sometimes it's just easier for me to type into Google what I want. I know, but I'm going to show you how to get there from the library's homepage too, so don't stress it. So I typed in, Wounded Knee, Library of Congress, and I got some great stuff. Let me share my screen with you. Okay. So I typed that in and I came to this page, and I think it's one that Dr. Graham mentioned earlier too. And it's very interesting that this is under immigration and relocation on the Library of Congress, right? It's all about that language, those words that we are choosing to kind of group things under. But how I got to this, if you want to do this from the library's page, you go to Library of Congress, their homepage, loc.gov, teachers, classroom materials, and then it's a presentation. I don't know why it's called a presentation, but that's where it is. And then you can see immigration and relocation in U.S. history. And they have it broken down into all of these different immigrant categories, country categories, things like that. And I clicked on Native American. And you can see we have disaster at Wounded Knee right here. So when I was doing this and I found this initial piece through my search, I was like, oh, there's a newspaper article here, which means there has to be something in Chronicling America on Wounded Knee. Has anybody used Chronicling America? If you have, just let me know in the chat box. Yes, no. So can y'all tell me? Did you see?
We have a couple yeses, a couple nos.
Okay.
It looks pretty mixed.
Okay, I thought it might be a mixed bag. So if you've joined us on our other newsletter webinars, I love Chronicling America. I'm going to show you how to get there. So you just go to loc.gov/rr/news. And then I can put this in the chat box if you'd like that as well. And we have Chronicling America here. And I like to go to topics in Chronicling America and go to the alphabetical list because you can get so much information here, and you can do your Control F. So I did my Control F knowing there was something probably on Wounded Knee, hoping. And I found the Wounded Knee Massacre topics in Chronicling America. And what I love about this is it gives me a timeline that I can work with. If I go to read more about it right here, it gives me other search words to use when I'm looking for newspaper articles. This is fantastic for our students because if we want them to do an activity where they're using newspapers and searching through the library, sometimes it's really hard to get those right terms. So if they can have these as a launch pad, they know who to search for, what to search for, things like that. It's really, really helpful. And so these are my search words. These are all newspaper articles that are linked and have these words. If you haven't used Chronicling America before, when you pull it up, the words that you're looking for in that search are going to be in red. It's really helpful, and you can zoom in using your keypad. You can move around. You can clip certain pieces. So if I wanted to zoom in right here and clip that, I could, and I just have that piece there. So very helpful. And so I started thinking, oh, well, if there's one on Wounded Knee, I wonder if there's one for ghost dancing, because that's one of the key terms there. So ghost dancing. The ghost dance movement is also a topic in Chronicling America where we can fit these pieces in. So I found this. We have our timeline again here. To read more about it, we can go and see. And then I saw these search terms. And this is kind of where you will see that I found those breadcrumbs that I needed to keep going. Right here, Wavaka, he's a prophet. He gives a fantastic speech. I linked it in, or I guess a message he gives. I linked that in the lesson plan for this. I was able to find his message, talking about ghost dancing, talking about his influence. So I kind of took this crumb right here with his name and ran with it. And that's how I found a lot of resources. And then I remembered there is a video. I used this when I was teaching last year on ghost dancing. So you can show your students what this would look like and show them these events leading up to Wounded Knee. Wavaka, his message as a prophet to the Sioux, this ghost dancing movement that kind of took off, and then Wounded Knee. But as I was doing this, I started thinking, there are not, like I said, these are not just singular events. We need to show our students that all of these events are connected. Everything is building off of one another. They're not just happening separate of one another, right? So I started thinking about those timeline pieces and what different acts, what different legislation was passed during this time period. And I started thinking immediately of the Homestead Act. I know that's a standard for a lot of people. So we have right here the Homestead Act through Library of Congress. If you just Google that or go to the Library of Congress search bar and type in the Homestead Act, you'll get this fantastic PDF here. So this is something you can show your students in 1862, not 1962, excuse me. These things are being passed in 1862. We have settlers moving in. In 1868, we have the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the second one, which essentially says that the Black Hills belong to the Sioux for as long as the grass shall grow there, right? So you can ask your students, well, do you think that happened, right? No, because we get conflicts later on because of that in that same area. So I found this Homestead Act, started thinking about people moving in, eventually leading to those conflicts. And then I found right here, this is not a Library of Congress website. This is through our documents. But what I love about our documents is you can get a transcript for some things that aren't maybe transcribed. So you can do a document transcript. And then you know what you're looking for, what article you're looking for specifically in the Library of Congress document if it's not completely transcribed. Or in this case, it was in the National Archives, right? So I was able to look through these documents and find out which article specifically I needed because I was able to look at this transcription from our documents. So very helpful there. And like I said, these are just things that help me kind of piece together. So we have the Homestead Act, the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, and we also have the Dawes Act, right? I think that's 1888, 1887. This is also through our documents, but we have right here, the Dawes Act is another topic in Chronicling America. So we have up here, let me just scroll up so you all can see. There are a lot of topics. I thought that'd be easier to get to. But right here, Dawes Act and Commission in Chronicling America. So more newspaper articles, more timelines, more, I need to click on that. Sorry, my mouse got a little too excited. More pieces that you can look for. Look right here. And then you have all of these other search words that can lead you to other pieces. So when looking for resources for this lesson plan, I like to put together a timeline, go to Chronicling America and find the keywords and see what I can get from other searches. And I want to encourage you all, if you haven't used Chronicling America, to use this as a resource with your students and for your own lesson planning, things like that as well. There are so many search words that I never think of until I go to Chronicling America that are super helpful. And the last thing I wanted to show y'all, I know this is not a Library of Congress resource, but I just found it and I wish I'd put it in the newsletter. It's from the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. It's basically breaks down the Treaty of Fort Laramie for your students. Very interesting. It takes you through a case study. You have conflicts, the preamble. And what I love about it the most is this map here. You can look at this map and on the timeline down here, let me move my little bar, my Zoom bar is in the way. Let me just make this smaller for you guys. So on the timeline, you can see prior to 1868, and pull that up and show your students. Following the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, what happens? And then lands today. So you can kind of see and show your students, let me zoom out a little bit more, how this has changed and evolved. And really, if they, like, I don't think the Treaty of Fort Laramie is in our standards either, but this will help seeing these government policies and these acts and these laws and legislations push forward that led to the conflicts. I think it's, like I said, so important to teach our students that these events are not singular. Everything is happening as a result of something else. So to make those connections. And that's really, like I said, all I have to share. That's just kind of my thought process when approaching lesson ideas. And this lesson idea was really fun to explore and find new resources.
Thank you, Layla. And one other thing that I'll add as we begin to finish up, because I know we're already after 5 o'clock. I actually found most of the sources that I did through the Century of Lawmaking collection. And I am not encouraging anyone to go spend tons of time in that collection, because while there is some great things there, it is a challenge to work through. That is one of the oldest collections that the library has digitized. And actually the piece that I found was 2 pages out of a like 780 page record that there is no way to do a keyword search of. So like I said, it can take some time, it can be a little cumbersome, but the thing I will say is if you have time and you are doing that kind of research, I was amazed at some of the things that I could find in that record. So it's what that collection is. They have a lot of the early congressional records from like about the first 50, 60 years of the US government. And so they had then within that some of the records, some of the different units. So I actually was to find this like 800-page report on Indian affairs. And within that is where they had all this correspondence, again, some from, correspondence that was sent from the different Indian groups. And then some of it was records from the different commissioners and, people that the US government had sent to work with various tribes. So you have to have some context for a lot of it and do a lot of digging. But at the same time, you can find some really cool stuff in that. And we're going to keep kind of mining that and looking for some things that we can incorporate into lesson plans. Because I know, again, because I spent like 6 hours one day finding those 2 documents. So I'm happy to spend that time and find some things that you guys can use, because I know you don't always have time to do that. All right, so let's wrap up. So again, just a quick reminder. You can find all of the references, our newsletter, PowerPoints, those kind of things on the Padlet. And so you have the QR code and the web link there. We are going to be giving away a book, and October is going to pull up our wheel here in just a second. We are giving away a copy of Lies My Teacher Told Me, the Young Readers Edition. But before I turn it over to her to do that, I'm going to go ahead and mention that we do ask that everyone complete a short survey. It's how we, again, mark that you completed attendance and how you will get PD certificates if you're interested in that for today. We'll drop the link in the chat box, but please do take a moment to complete that survey for us. And again, thank you guys so much for your time and attention today. Our digging in for next month is going to be a little different. So instead of doing a 1-hour session, we're going to be doing a 3-hour virtual workshop. And so it is going to be on the topic of how religion shaped America. We're going to have Dr. Andrew Polk from the MTSU Department of History joining us to do a little bit of a Q&A, and we'll have some different kind of activities, actually do some virtual breakout groups. So again, it's going to be formatted a little different. It's going to be a 3-hour session. If you're interested in that, let me know. I'll be happy to get you registered. And we will be filming portions of it, recording that to include later on, but we won't, of course, do the whole 3-hour piece on our YouTube channel. So again, with that, again, we'll drop that link in the chat box, but I'm going to turn things over to October to get back to who's getting a free book today.
Yeah, let me go ahead and share my screen so you can see our giveaway wheel.
All right. So Jenny, if you will either just drop your address, if you want to just private message that to me, or you can email it to me, we'll get that in the mail to you. And again, thank you everyone for joining today. And I know I've had a couple of you message me about signing up for next month. Again, I'll get you guys added and email you that you have been added to that. So thank you guys. We're going to be sticking around. So if you've got any questions, feel free to stick around. You can ask those for us, but I'm going to go ahead and end our recording.